Good morning, good morning. Welcome to the Capital CoLabs webinar that is a continuation of the work-based learning in the Capital Region series that we have launched. We're going to give everyone just a minute to get settled, get your coffee or your lunch, depending on where you are at this point in the day, and we will get started here in just a minute. We're watching all of you trickle in as the webinar software platform is getting us up and running. So I'm going to give you just another minute here as we fill the dead air, something that I have become increasingly good at, I think. So hi, everyone. My name is Jeanne Contardo. I'm the Managing Director of the Capital CoLab at the Greater Washington Partnership. Really delighted to have you all here today and to participate in this webinar on work-based learning in the Capital Region. We are joined today by Evan Rosenberg, who is currently a Senior Workforce Development Specialist at the U.S. Department of Labor. He has worked in the Employment and Training Administration for 23 years in the areas of performance management and youth programs, and is currently working on policy and performance for the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, which is WIOA. So he's going to be able to talk to us a lot about competitive grant programs, about WIOA, and about apprenticeship. So before we get started, as I know some of you are still getting settled and getting ready to go, couple things. One, if you would tell us who you are. So we're going to try and be a little bit interactive today. So if you'd use the chat feature to just drop in the chat what your name is, what organization you're from, and why you're here today. What's the one thing that you hope to learn? That would be really helpful as we are driving this conversation. And I'm going to give some intro remarks. So if you go ahead and drop that in the chat while I talk, and then I'm going to kick the floor over to Evan here. So the Capital CoLab, for those of you who came solely because you were interested in Evan, which I can't blame you for that. I am going to give you a brief overview though on the Capital CoLab. Capital CoLab is an action-oriented partnership rooted at the Greater Washington Partnership between educators and business leaders who are really trying to build the most diverse digital tech workforce in the country. So we, with our partners, we now are up to 20 university partners, 5 K-12 jurisdictions, and 18 employers, are working to ensure that we solve this persistent challenge that we see when we're trying to build diverse digital tech talent. And that's namely that there's, one, not enough capacity in the system for everyone to be able to function as effectively as they need. But there's also some misinformation in the system, and sometimes not a streamlined way for businesses to tell educators what it is they need in digital tech fields, and for educators then to be able to embed that into their curriculum. So we're trying to solve that problem to ensure that employers can find everything they need as they are building their workforce and their diverse workforce in particular. So as we look at this program at the Capital CoLab, we certainly are very, very concerned with making sure that students have the knowledge, skills, and abilities they need to enter the workforce in digital tech and be highly competitive. But the other piece that is vitally important to us is making sure that students have work-based learning opportunities. And so we know that, especially as we look at diverse talent and diverse people, that a key element of being able to enter the job and the workforce on day one, being ready, is having that experience, having those opportunities to actually demonstrate that you have applied those knowledge, skills, and abilities. So our work-based learning effort within the Capital CoLab has been really key because we recognize, again, that students need different types of opportunities at different points in time, and that employers often want to engage with students differently depending on where they are in the pipeline as well. So we're really working to build this ecosystem around work-based learning to ensure that students have access to the awareness activities, to the exposure activities, to make sure they even know what digital tech is and what employers are doing in the space, that they have the opportunity to experience digital tech through micro internships, regular internships, mentoring activities. And finally, then, that we see some students, some learners will want immersion activities. So they'll want activities and the opportunity to really dive in and be able to engage through programs like Apprenticeship that are intended to help students and learners, while they're earning money and working, also gain the knowledge and skills they need. So this work-based learning is a key element to us. And again, I want to thank you, Evan, for being here today to talk to us about everything happening at the Department of Labor and to walk us through, in particular, as we imagine a regional strategy that is located obviously in the nation's capital and in our surrounding environments from Baltimore all the way down to Richmond. How do we make sure that we're maximizing the federal investment in this space and what's happening at the Department of Labor? So Evan, thank you again for being here. I can't imagine a better person to walk us through all of this information. Now, you all are using the chat, so you know how to use it. Evan has said that he is completely fine if you want to drop questions in the chat during his presentation. And then after his presentation, we'll also have some Q&A. I'll moderate some questions and we'll make sure that we circle back to anything that's not addressed during his presentation. So feel free, as ideas ping, go ahead and put them in the chat and we'll make sure that we get back to them. Evan, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks, Jeannie, I appreciate it. Good morning, everybody. Happy to be here. If you haven't already, please let us know who you are in the chat and what you're interested in hearing about. So far, I see people are interested in hearing about apprenticeship, which is great. I can talk lots about apprenticeship this morning. That is definitely a focus area for us at the Department of Labor, Employment and Training Administration. So keep those chats coming about what you would like to hear about. And as you just heard, you know, if you have questions during my presentation, just put them in the chat. I'll monitor it as I speak and try and get to that if I can, or if not, at the end, we'll take questions. As I'm sure you all know, in the time of COVID and working from home, you'll see people with pets around. I do have a cat who likes to make appearances, particularly when I'm on camera on Zoom or Teams. So I imagine my cat will make an appearance at some point. So you should anticipate that. All right, well, let's get started. Destiny, if you could go to our next slide. So what I'll talk about this morning is I'm going to give you a quick overview of ETA youth programs that fund work-based learning opportunities. There are lots of them, and I want to make sure folks are aware of the various ETA youth programs that we have, particularly that focus on work-based learning opportunities. I'll talk about how to partner with our youth workforce system and how to engage with them, and then we'll take some Q&A at the end. Next slide. All right, so we have a few polling questions. I want to get a sense of what you are familiar with out there. So Destiny, why don't you put up our first polling question? How many of you are familiar with WIOA, which is the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act? All right, so I'm seeing that more of you are not familiar with it than are. So it sounds like I should have an overview of WIOA and share with you exactly what it is. Hopefully everyone will answer yes by the end of this presentation. If I did some post-test polling questions. The Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, that is the guiding legislation for our nation's workforce system, and the majority of our workforce system programs are funded by WIOA, including the majority of programs I'll talk about today. So you will learn all about WIOA this morning. All right, let's do our next polling question. Do you interact in some way with your local workforce development board? All right, again, it sounds like there are more no's than anything else. So I will talk to you all about what workforce development boards are and how to interact with them. And as it relates to partnership and tapping into our workforce development system, the Workforce Development Board is the entity that you would want to start with. So if you're not already working with them, which sounds like many of you are not, and you're interested in apprenticeship or any work-based learning funded by the Department of Labor, that is the entity you would want to work with. And I'll talk more about that shortly. All right, last polling question. Let's put that one up, Destiny. Are you involved in pre-apprenticeship or registered apprenticeship programs? And do we have some results? There they are. Interesting, only a couple of you are involved in pre-apprenticeship or registered apprenticeship programs. So I will definitely share more with you about what a pre-apprenticeship and registered apprenticeship program is and the advantages of them. All right, so it sounds like my presentation will answer all of these questions that I asked about. So let's get on with it and get to my presentation. Next slide. All right, so a quick overview of ETA youth programs, and I'm not going to go into super detail about any of these, although I'll probably focus on the WIOA Youth Formula Funded Program the most, since that is a national program that is everywhere, including in every local area within the greater DC area. I do want to give you a sense of what we fund for youth as it relates to work-based learning. So there are 4 primary youth programs that we fund. Hopefully you're familiar with at least the first 2. Those are our largest, most well-funded. There's Job Corps that is a primarily residential 16 to 24-year-old employment and training program, and I'll have a slide or 2 on that in a minute. WIOA, which I talked about, that's our guiding legislation. This one doesn't have a catchy name. It's just named after the legislation that funds it, but our WIOA Youth Formula Funded Program, for formula funded, meaning every state gets funding from WIOA based on a formula that includes a few factors, unemployment, and things of that nature. And then YouthBuild, smaller program, really neat program. I'll talk a little bit about YouthBuild, primarily a construction training program for out-of-school youth that builds affordable housing. And then lastly, our reentry employment opportunities program, which we have for both adult and youth, and this focuses on youth involved in either the adult or juvenile justice system and getting them employment and training skills. So I'll talk a little bit about each of these quickly this morning, but if you have specific questions about any of those programs, feel free to enter that into the chat and I'll be happy to address them. Next slide. So just real quickly, just so you know what Job Corps is, 16 to 24-year-olds, they have to have one of these barriers in order to qualify for the program. I won't go through them all, but I just wanted you to have this information so you're aware of what Job Corps is. Next slide. And the program design, it focuses on academic, vocational, IT, employability, and independent living skills. It's typically in a residential setting. It's a really neat program. If you haven't seen a Job Corps program, I'd encourage you to go see one. There are a few Job Corps programs in the DC area, including one in the district. Typically, a young person identifies a specific occupation and focuses on that occupation while simultaneously working on their high school equivalency, if they don't already have it, or high school diploma in some Job Corps centers. Serves approximately 60,000 students a year and approximately 125 centers nationwide. A lot of the centers are actually in rural areas. This is a program that was created during the Johnson administration back in the 60s. And the idea was taking youth out of their environments in the inner city and having them in rural areas where they're learning skills. It's evolved from that. And so there are urban and rural Job Corps centers these days, but it's a really neat program and a great experience for young people. So if nothing else, just be aware of it in case you're working with any young people where that might be a good employment and training solution. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to talk now about how our WIOA Youth Formula Funded program is set up. I think this is probably the most important program for you to be aware of because, again, it is a national program. And the way it works is our funding from the U.S. Department of Labor goes to a state agency, typically a state workforce development board. So every state in the country gets funding for adult, dislocated worker, youth funds. I'm going to talk about the youth funds today. And it ranges from the smallest amount typically is around $2.2 million to smaller states. And then states like California get, over $100 million. And then that funding gets dispersed to local areas. Each state has, some rural states have one local workforce development area, and others like California have roughly 50, and everything in between. And the local workforce development boards, as I mentioned before, that's kind of the key coordinating entity of our workforce programs funded by WIOA, and that's true for the youth program as well. So the funding goes from the state to the local workforce development board, and then for youth programs, they can either operate the program themselves or they contract out with youth service providers, which includes our American Job Centers, which are all over the country. Those are basically the job centers where people go when they're out of work and looking for work or looking for job training skills. And then those providers provide the direct services. At the bottom of this slide, you'll see a link to a website, servicelocator.org. That is where you can find like the closest American Job Center to you in wherever you are in the country. And then it'll also have information on the local workforce development board, who that is and how to get in touch with them. So after this presentation, if you're convinced that you should be working with your local workforce development board as it relates to working with them on helping youth access work-based learning, you can get that from Service Locator. Next slide. Okay, so the WIOA Youth Program, it has an in-school and out-of-school component. 16 to 24-year-olds for out-of-school, 14 to 21-year-olds for in-school, and the individuals to be eligible for the program need to meet one of the following barriers. They're pretty all-encompassing, and so a lot of young people will meet the definition, particularly out-of-school youth, because there is no low income requirement for out-of-school, as opposed to in-school, where young people do have to be low income. But a lot of these categories, many of our youth in the country will fit in. And then that last category, an individual who requires additional assistance, that's kind of a catch-all barrier. And so a number of young people will meet eligibility just through that barrier if they're the right age and if they're in school, if they're low income. Next slide. So these are, I won't go through all of them, but these are the 14 program elements under the WIOA Youth Program. It's a very comprehensive program, as you can see, includes academic, vocational, and supportive type services. And I bolded the work experience summer employment service. Work experience is the key program element in this program. And I will talk about why and how that is the priority program element for this program in a moment. Next slide. Okay, so youth work experience under WIOA. What is a work experience? It's a planned, structured learning experience that takes place in a workplace for a limited amount of time. And one key thing, one of the biggest things we learned during COVID is that virtual work experiences work. And it is a great way to get youth even more access to more types of work-based learning opportunities. As you can imagine, our programs had to quickly shift during COVID and figure out a new model where they were working with young people without actually doing in-person services. And they were able to fairly quickly shift to, not quite as robust, but still active virtual work experience type model where they were connecting youth to virtual work experiences. And that's something that we envision continuing post-COVID. It's, I always try to look for the silver linings in, really difficult times. And I think that is one of the silver linings from COVID is we've learned flexibility and different ways of doing things. And virtual work experience is one example for our youth programs that we've learned. So our work experiences for our young people contain both an academic and occupational education component. And then you can see the different types of work experiences. So it's a range from something as small as job shadowing, where maybe a young person is just spending a week learning about a specific job, to something as intense as a summer employment or year-round employment opportunity, or on-the-job training, internship, or pre-apprenticeship program. So there's a pretty large range of intensity of our work experience programs. Next slide. And then the other piece you should know about WIOA is that, as I mentioned earlier, work experience is the one program element prioritized above all the other ones through a minimum expenditure requirement. And so in our legislation, it requires that not less than 20% of those funds that go to our local workforce development boards for youth must be spent on paid and unpaid work experiences. And so our programs are required to spend at least a fifth of their funds on work experience. And so work experience, as you can imagine, is one of the key program elements for our programs. And then our programs track and report how much they spend on work experience. Typically, across the state, we see about a quarter of their funds spent on work experience. Next slide. So just quickly about the other couple programs, YouthBuild, as I mentioned, it's a program that focuses on construction trades, 16 to 24 out-of-school youth. They spend half their time in a classroom working on their high school equivalency, and then half the time on the job site learning construction skills. We fund over 250 YouthBuild programs in almost every state. It's not a huge program in that we only serve roughly 7,000 youth annually. There are a few YouthBuild programs in the greater DC area. And then one thing that has started to evolve over the last few years with YouthBuild is a construction plus model, and where we allow grantees who have previously gotten YouthBuild funding and shown that they were successful to apply for grants. Oh, there's my cat. Apply for grants where they can do other areas in addition to construction. So some might focus on construction and a couple other industries like information technology or financial or something like that. So that is kind of a new evolving piece of the YouthBuild program. Next slide. And I talked a little bit about this, alternate between classroom and work site. They build or renovate affordable housing in their communities, and then that affordable housing is provided to a family in need, it's a really neat program because there's so many different benefits of it, both from the training side for at-risk youth, but then also on the affordable housing side, that an affordable house is actually built for low-income folks in the community. They also do community service projects and learn leadership skills. Next slide. And then lastly, for our youth programs, our RIO youth program, that's focused on youth in the juvenile justice system. There's a few bullets around that. It's basically various discretionary and when I say discretionary, competitive grant programs where we put out a solicitation and community-based organizations apply for a competitive grant funding opportunity. And we fund different types of reentry programs related to, youth in the juvenile justice system, prevention of youth recidivating, things of that nature. So if that's a population you're working with, you'll want to talk to your local workforce development board about if they have any RIO youth funding. Next slide. All right, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about apprenticeship programs. This is an area that is absolutely a priority in our current administration and something we really focused on in ETA for the last few years. Registered apprenticeship has a long history in our country, and apprenticeship has a long history throughout the world. I would say in the past, the US hasn't had nearly the focus on the apprenticeship model that we've seen in some Western European countries like Germany and Switzerland. I'm sure you're somewhat familiar with the apprenticeship model and, how well it's been done in other countries in Western Europe. Whereas in the US, it's just much smaller, but, we're realizing that it is a great model and we're really trying to build it up in the United States, and particularly in the Employment and Training Administration, where our Office of Apprenticeship is housed. It's a really big focus these days. So here's a little bit about registered apprenticeship, proven model of job preparation. And there's a whole formal validation system, either by the Federal Department of Labor or a Department of Labor recognized state apprenticeship agency. It's an interesting model in that about half the country, half the states have state apprenticeship agencies, which do all the registration of the apprenticeships and the approval process. And then half the states don't have a state apprenticeship agency. So all that is done at the federal level at the Department of Labor. Same process, just state agency versus federal agency. An apprenticeship combines two key things: on-the-job training with related instruction. And so by the end of it, you have done a whole bunch of hours of on-the-job training, as well as specific classroom hours for related instruction. And I'll show you a little bit about that in a moment. It's an effective way for employers to recruit, train, and retain highly skilled workers. Allows workforce partners, educators, employers to work together to increase the quality of the workforce. And the really great thing about registered apprenticeship is it's immediate employment for the apprentices. So they are being paid unsubsidized wages by the employer while learning on the job. And then the idea is at the end of it, they will be, a full-time employee with a sustainable wage. Graduates of apprenticeships get a nationally recognized portable credential that may be applied toward further post-secondary education. Next slide. So here are the 5 core elements of a registered apprenticeship program. 1, direct employer involvement. Employers are the foundation of registered apprenticeships. The structured on-the-job learning or on-the-job training, and there are very specific minimums for that. An apprenticeship must either last a year for competency-based occupations, or at least 2,000 hours of on-the-job learning or training for time-based occupations. And the difference is when you register an occupation, you'll either register it as competency-based or time-based. And then there's the related instruction piece, where our federal regulations recommend a minimum of 144 hours of related instructions. And this is either classroom or through occupational or industrial courses. Or it could be self-studied, but it all has to be approved by the registration agency, either DOL or the state apprenticeship agency. And then there are rewards for skill gains. An apprentice has to at least have 1 increase in pay over the course of their apprenticeship. Typically, we see more. So there's that wage increase that's built in, and then the national occupational credential. Every graduate of a registered apprenticeship receives a nationally recognized credential, which is referred to as a certificate of completion, either issued by us at the Department of Labor, or if it's within a state that has a state apprenticeship agency, the state apprenticeship agency issues that credential. And that is a recognized credential nationally, and is a great thing for an apprentice to have. And then the thing I would also add is that while apprenticeships in the past, they've been more of an adult focus. Oh, good, here's my cat again. We're really starting to focus on youth apprenticeships and trying to create opportunities and pipelines for young people to go straight from high school into apprenticeship opportunities, as opposed to having all young people on the 2 or 4 year college track. Next slide. So now I want to talk a little bit about pre-apprenticeship programs. The pre-apprenticeship kind of concept is not nearly as formal as the registered apprenticeship. So as the name implies, registered apprenticeship, it's very formal. You register it with the Department of Labor. Whereas a pre-apprenticeship is not formal, there's no registration process, and it's more of an all-encompassing term of, an occupational skills training program that will hopefully lead into a registered apprenticeship. So this is much more of a youth-focused concept to help young people get prepared for a registered apprenticeship. So you can see those 5 bullets below pre-apprenticeship. These are kind of what we put in our regulations of expectations for what a pre-apprenticeship would be. The training curriculum aligned with the skill needs of employers and the economy, access to educational and career counseling and supportive services, then the hands-on learning piece, and then the exploring career options piece, opportunities to attain a credential, and then lastly, a partnership with one or more registered apprenticeship programs with the idea that the pre-apprenticeship prepares young people for the registered apprenticeship and then leads into it. Next slide. So I want to talk quickly about a fairly new grant program we have, the Youth Apprenticeship Readiness grants. So in the last probably 4 or 5 years, we have received funding from Congress specific to apprenticeship. And this is a new thing for the Department of Labor. Prior to 5 or so years ago, we never received direct funding for grant programs for apprenticeships. So, prior to 5-6 years ago, there were no grant programs related to apprenticeships. But each of the last 5-6 years, we have received funding from Congress to directly fund grant programs related to expanding apprenticeship opportunities. And that funding has progressively increased over the last couple of years. So not only is apprenticeship a priority of our administration at the Department of Labor, it also is a priority of Congress, which is always nice when those two things match up. And for the first time last year, the Department of Labor chose to focus specifically on youth apprenticeship grants. And we had a funding opportunity for community organizations to apply to get an apprenticeship grant directly focused on developing or expanding registered apprenticeships for young people. So as a new grant program, we awarded funds last June, so almost a year ago. 14 organizations across the country support 16 to 24-year-olds, either go into existing registered apprenticeship programs or create new registered apprenticeship programs for those young people. And I work pretty closely with those grants, and so far they're doing really well. And hopefully we'll see more grant opportunities for youth apprenticeship in the future. One other thing just to be aware of is there is an act called the National Apprenticeship Act that goes back years, and Congress is looking at reauthorizing the National Apprenticeship Act. And I believe it has already passed one house or one side of Congress. I believe it was the House that passed it. And in that National Apprenticeship Act reauthorization, it actually has a specific call out for the concept of youth apprenticeship and pre-apprenticeship and registration for both of them, which is exciting to see that there's a focus not only on registered apprenticeship, but also youth and pre-apprenticeship in a potentially reauthorized National Apprenticeship Act. It's important to keep in mind this hasn't become law yet, and it is still being worked on. And the other side of Congress needs to take action on it, and then the two houses have to work together to finalize it. So it's still a bit away from reality, but hopefully that will happen sometime in the near future. Next slide. So I wanted to talk just quickly about some potential future funding opportunities. I know everybody's always interested in that. And my first bullet is related to what I was just speaking about, future apprenticeship program opportunities. We continue to get an appropriation from Congress to fund specific apprenticeship grants. And as I mentioned, we've done some youth apprenticeship grants. And so I foresee that continuing. So I would say be on the lookout for apprenticeship grant opportunities from the Department of Labor. Another exciting piece is in our most recent budget requests that the president just released in the last week or two. In addition to an increase in our WIOA youth funding, it also included a $50 million summer jobs proposal. And keep in mind, this is just a budget request from the president to Congress, and it's Congress that gets to decide how much and what money to appropriate to us. So there's no guarantee that actually happens, but that proposal is in there and worth noting. And then bills in Congress. There was a very exciting piece of legislation introduced in the House just last month called the Connecting Youth to Jobs Act that proposes lots of new funding opportunities for youth programs with a big focus on work-based learning. Again, this was just a bill introduced in Congress, and there's not any guarantee of anything actually happening with it. But kind of the takeaway here is that there's lots of interest in youth programming, particularly related to employment and training and work-based learning. And hopefully we will see more in the coming months and year related to additional funding for youth work-based training programs. And then potential WIOA reauthorization. Congress is currently looking at reauthorizing the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, that key piece of legislation I talk about that funds all the workforce programs in our country. There have already been hearings on the House side on that. The first WIOA reauthorization hearing was last month, and it focused on youth programs. We were pretty excited in our youth division to see that youth was the first hearing. Lots of interest in youth programs. And then the other one, I didn't have a bullet on it, but I wanted to call your attention to it, is some of the funding related to the response to COVID, I think is worth noting in terms of future funding opportunities. So I imagine you're all familiar with the American Rescue Plan Act, ARPA. And that money is going to states and local areas as we speak. And there's a big emphasis in it on students. And so state and local education agencies are receiving a lot of funding, and it's pretty flexible funding. It's not coming from us at the Department of Labor, but a lot of state and local education agencies will have funding, and they're trying to figure out how to spend that funding. And there is flexibility to use it for work-based learning for students. And so that is an area that I would encourage you to talk to your state and local education agencies about. How are they planning to use that funding? And there are probably opportunities with that funding to fund work-based learning opportunities for students. Next slide. So partnerships, I'll just spend a minute or two on this. Our whole workforce system, it's all about partnerships. Our workforce development boards I've talked about, they are partnerships of employers and community-based organizations, service providers, other federally funded programs, things like the TANF and housing authorities. That workforce board is where all of the entities come together. They are the convener of all the entities that should partner in order to oversee workforce programs in your area. And so, as I mentioned earlier, if you haven't been partnering with your local workforce development board, I would strongly encourage you to reach out to them, figure out how you fit into our workforce development system and in that board and our funding, and partner with them. Next slide. So these are the core and additional partner programs in the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. And I just wanted to give you a sense of how key partnerships are in our workforce development system. So the core partners are under the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. They're the Adult Youth Dislocated Worker Program, Adult Education Program, Employment Service Program, and then Vocational Rehabilitation Program in blue on the left of the slide. But then on the right-hand slide are all the additional partners. And I won't read them all to you, but you can see how broad the partnership of our workforce development boards are and how many different partners they encompass. And this is the large partnership that oversees workforce funding in all of our local areas. And so, hopefully you all fit in there somewhere. And this just gives you a sense of how broad that partnership is. Next slide. So we have a community of practice for our WIOA youth programs. That's the link to it is youth.workforcegps.org. And there are all kinds of great resources on that website. So if you want to learn more about anything I talked about today, I would say that's probably the best place to start. Next slide. And then if you have any questions, that's our general email address for WIOA youth programs. And if you have any specific questions about how to connect or anything like that, just send an email to that, and either me or someone on my team will see that, and we can help you out. So with that, I'm gonna, I think, turn it over to Jeanne, and we'll get started with some questions.
Great, thank you so much, Evan. And thank you, Destiny, for shutting down the slides so we can just look at each other. That was great. And I think super informative. And I loved the polling and hearing where our participants were in particular, and recognizing, so we have participants on the call or on the Zoom that are from a variety of different seats. So we have employers on the call, we have university partners on the call, we have folks who are engaging directly with the workforce development boards. So could you help me parse out a little bit as different stakeholder groups are trying to figure out how to most effectively engage with WIOA? Are there different ways that they should actually tackle it? If they were to go to should every single group go to the workforce investment boards, or are there different ways that you expect employers to actually think about engaging with this versus how universities might?
I think the workforce development boards are the best place to start because that is the convening entity with all the partnerships, and most likely all of your stakeholders probably fit into one of those groups that would be part of the workforce development board. And then if that's not the right place, then that entity could direct them to the right place. I mean, maybe what they'll do is send them to a specific youth provider who is operating a youth program and say, oh, it sounds like, as an employer, you could serve as a work experience site and talk to this youth provider that is operating work experience programs in the IT field. Or if it was a university, they could direct them to the right part of our workforce development system. So it really depends on who you are and where they would direct you. But the place I would start is definitely the Workforce Development Board or the American Job Center, which is kind of the idea. They used to be called one-stop centers, and they were rebranded a number of years ago into American Job Centers under the Obama administration. But there is an American Job Center in every area of the country, and that is where the majority of our WIOA programs are operated. So that is probably the other place to start, is the American Job Center and someone there. The one kind of tricky piece about finding your American Job Center is, and this is where the federal government doesn't do a great job, is in branding and having like a national brand where things are called the same thing all over the country. And so our WIOA youth programs are called something different depending on the state. And the American Job Centers are called something different depending on the state. And even our workforce development boards, sometimes they have different names depending on the state, because different states like to do their own branding. So it can be a little tricky trying to figure out the name of the entity you're looking for. And that servicelocator.org website is the best place to go, because you can just put in what area of the country you're in, and it'll give you the contact information for the American Job Center, for the Workforce Development Board. So that's probably the place I would start.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And I think that answered the question that was in the Q&A as well. So that is super helpful. For those CoLAB partners that are participating in the webinar today, we can help in this region. So if you are anywhere in the region from Baltimore down to Richmond, we can help connect you with the workforce boards. So just know that we're available, and that there are groups like CoLAB all around the country that can also potentially step in and help. So if you're not in our region and you're trying to figure out how to engage, you can certainly reach out to us. And if we know them in other parts of the country, we're happy to connect you to. So just know that we're always happy to be a resource. So on that note, Evan, one of the benefits that I think you have is that you do have a national lens, you have a federal lens because of where you sit and the kinds of programs that you are helping to support. So in this region, we don't like to recreate the wheel. We hate to duplicate effort. So if we can borrow best practices or borrow really good ideas, or take good ideas and kick them up a notch that are happening in other regions, that's really our preference. So as you look across the country, are there any models or any really exciting ideas that you're seeing that you think, wow, that would be really cool to see in the capital region?
Yeah, there are a few interesting models, and I kind of referenced one of them, particularly as it relates to work-based learning. Having a virtual component of it, I think, is really exciting. It's not something that we ever thought about prior to COVID. And then our programs had to pivot really quickly because we couldn't just stop serving young people, particularly vulnerable youth who during the pandemic become even more vulnerable. And it was so important to stay connected to those young people and continue to serve them. And the thing about today's youth is they are so technologically savvy, and a virtual work experience is very realistic for our young people. And the neat thing about it, I mean, this doesn't necessarily apply so much to the DC area because there aren't many parts of the greater DC area that are rural, although, a couple that fall into greater DC area. But in rural areas where for years our programs kind of, I don't want to use the word complain, but, talked about how difficult it was to find quality work experiences in specific occupations in rural areas. And then transportation was so difficult getting young people to those work experiences. All of a sudden, with virtual work experiences, they can connect to any employer anywhere if you can set it up. And so, if a youth is interested in a certain occupation that doesn't exist in their local area, they could connect them to someone in that occupation outside of their local area, which I think is wonderful. So that's something we've seen a lot of, which has been great. We've seen a lot more apprenticeship type models popping up, which I talked about, and pre-apprenticeship models. And we are very, as you could tell from my presentation, very encouraged by that model, particularly for young people. And there are lots of different ways of doing it, structuring it so that, the K through 12 system connects directly with employers for registered apprenticeships or for programs for pre-apprenticeships, and making that seamless connection from K through 12 to the apprenticeship system, particularly because, I think we've been learning in the last decade or so is that, our country has always, emphasized, post-secondary education, and the amount of students out there with student debt where they go to college because that's all they know to do and that's what they're told by guidance counselors, and then they drop out after a year or two and they're in debt. Not a great solution for a lot of our young people, whereas going into more occupational training apprenticeship type opportunities straight from high school is often a better fit, a less costly fit. And so we've seen a lot of success with that model. And then, I would encourage folks to visit a couple of our other advocacy organizations that have examples of local areas that are, doing different models. So I have a couple suggestions for you because I had a feeling you might ask me about this. One is the National Youth Employment Coalition, which is a coalition of a lot of our community-based youth programs. And so I think it's nyec.org, but you can just Google National Youth Employment Coalition and they'll have lots of member organizations and information about the work that they do. And then the other one is the Aspen Institute. They have an Opportunity Youth Forum in Aspen that has, I think, 24 organizations that have innovative youth programming, mostly related to employment. And so if you look at Aspen's Opportunity Youth Forum on their website, I was just looking at that last night in preparation for this discussion, and they had lots of neat examples of programs around the country. So those are probably two other places I would look for examples.
That's terrific. Thank you. And we have Destiny, who's like the voice of God, typing and putting links in the chat for us so we can all track those down really easily. I have a couple of nuts and bolts questions now that I just want to put in front of you as people on the webinar are thinking about how do I tap into this work a little more effectively. So first and foremost, are there any new key requirements that stakeholders need to know for their WIOA reauthorization plan?
So with WIOA, it's reauthorization is still in process, and it's, a moving target. So, I don't have a crystal ball, and I have no idea what will ultimately end up in WIOA reauthorization. So there's nothing to know at this point, other than to know that there is a lot of interest on the Hill in reauthorizing WIOA, which is really exciting for us. This is where someone working in policy for 23 years, it might sound silly, but my favorite thing is implementing new legislation and writing the regulations for the legislation. So I'm super excited about the prospects of WIOA reauthorization. It was last reauthorized, I think, in 2014. And prior to that, WIA was 1998. So we went from 98 to 2014 with the same legislation. And then in 2014, we had new legislation that we've had for 7 years now. And as you can imagine, workforce programming changes, the economy changes. And so it is important to update that legislation. So we're really excited that maybe it won't take 16 years this time around, and that there's already interest in reauthorizing WIOA and updating it. And, this year there's been more action on that than any previous year. And there seems to be a strong interest in Congress to reauthorize it. And there are currently hearings on it. And so that's really exciting. So hopefully something will happen in the next year. And then if that happens, there'll be lots of new information about the new requirements of WIOA and what it focuses on. But at this point, that's still in process.
Is it fair to hope, Evan, that many of the items that you talked about as being sort of the interesting and notable innovations around the country might actually show up in WIOA reauthorization? So in particular, I'm thinking, this issue of virtual work-based learning that wasn't even on the table, 7 years ago. I don't think anyone was thinking about that at all. Is that the kind of thing that might show up, given sort of the way the world has changed in the past 16 months?
So that's not an easy yes or no question. I'll answer it a little bit different way, which is kind of the broad major things you could expect to show up, like apprenticeship. I would expect to see more focus on apprenticeship and reauthorization, because that is, as I talked about, an area of focus in the past few years by Congress and by our administration. So as a broad thing, we expect a bigger emphasis on apprenticeship. As it relates to virtual work experience, that's a much smaller policy issue that we would probably handle in regulations. So how it works is Congress writes the act that has kind of the broad parameters for the program. And then we at the Department of Labor write the final rule, which is the regulations that implement the legislation. And that's where we would talk about the definition of a work experience. The legislation itself doesn't define work experience. That's what we do in our regulations and guidance. And, being part of the team that writes those regulations, I can tell you that we would, definitely take the lessons learned from this. And so be surprised if we were to write specific regulations or guidance that incorporates that concept of virtual work experience. But that happens, after the legislation is passed and we're implementing it.
Terrific. That's super helpful. Thank you. Another nuts and bolts question from our participants today. Is there a general time frame to expect when looking to get a program registered? And then in parentheses, RAP. So registered.
Oh, so the registered apprenticeship process. I don't know the time frame. It's a different part of ETA that does the registration process, but I work closely with our Office of Apprenticeship, and I can tell you they're a great team. And I don't think it takes forever to go through that registration process, but I know there's a lot involved because it's a very formal process and you have to write up all of the curriculum and the hours you're doing and what the OJT looks like, what the related instruction looks like. So it's not a simple, quick process. It's a very involved process, but I don't think it takes, years and years to do it. I couldn't give you an estimate, but I can tell you it's well worth looking into that process because we see great success in our registered apprenticeship programs.
Evan, if someone had a specific question, could they reach out to the email address you provided and you could forward them on to the right?
So I'll give you a different resource as it relates to the apprenticeship registration process. I would just go to our apprenticeship website at the Department of Labor. I don't know it off the top of my head, but
that Destiny does. I bet Destiny can put it in there.
Could look it up. But if you're looking for ETA Office of Apprenticeship, and I feel like there's apprenticeship.gov maybe as a website that would have all that information, but I know they have a great website with lots of resources. So I would just go directly to DOL's apprenticeship resources, which kind of feel like is apprenticeship.gov, but I bet Destiny will figure it out for us before we leave today.
There you go, just like that. It's amazing. Never want to do one of these without her. Couple other questions coming in as we're winding down on the amount of time we have here. One, do the youth participants, graduates of these programs, show interest in four-year degree programs, perhaps via 2 years at community colleges? So question about the intersection, I think, of formal education with more of these apprenticeship and other networks.
Yeah, I think some absolutely do. One of our WIOA youth program elements is around preparing youth for post-secondary education. And so our programs take them on college tours and expose them to the 2 and 4 year college system. And then another thing that our programs do is they help them try and figure out what career they're interested in. And there's all kinds of web-based tools that the Department of Labor funds that shows, if you want to do X career, here's the education it takes. And our programs show the young people that. And so their job is through career counseling to help them figure out what type of career pathway to go on. And then depending on what career pathway they're interested in, they connect them to the necessary 2 and 4 year degrees that you might need for that career pathway. Other young people, their career pathway might not necessarily go through a 4 year college. Maybe it's through a community college or, a technical school or things like that. So it really depends on the young people and what they're interested in and what would be appropriate for them. But, absolutely the 2 and 4 year degree programs are things that, youth are taught about and steered towards if it's appropriate.
That's great. Thank you. And it feels to me from where I sit that there is more alignment between educators and employers than there has ever been before. And so even if apprenticeship programs, you think of like trade apprenticeships that don't always tie to post-secondary, like that whole thing is changing. That whole dynamic, it feels like, is really shifting. So my perspective is that we're in a rapidly shifting ecosystem around apprenticeship. And so maybe it's like not your mother's apprenticeship. Like what we expect apprenticeships to look like is no longer the same.
That's absolutely true. And I'm glad you mentioned that because I would like to speak to that a little bit. Because, for me personally, I've learned a lot about apprenticeship in the last couple of years. And prior to 2 years ago, I rarely worked with our Office of Apprenticeship. And now it's one of my closest partners in ETA, and I work with them all the time. And our division jointly operates that youth program with them. And so what I've learned about apprenticeships in the last 2 years, it is definitely not our parents' apprenticeship system where it's only trade focused with HVAC and plumbing and carpentry, et cetera. The breadth of occupations that are apprenticeable is amazing to me. Like cybersecurity is one of the biggest new apprenticeship programs that I've seen, lots in the field of IT. It's definitely a 21st century apprenticeship system, and it is not just the trades anymore. And I think that maybe is the biggest message for employers out there is most occupations are probably apprenticeable in some way, and it's not just those traditional trades occupations anymore.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Evan. And I realize we are at time. So thank you. Thank you, Evan, for being here, for giving us all of this great information. I imagine you're going to get a lot of follow-up emails because this was a lot of content. I also just want to thank the team on the back end that was making things move. So you heard Destiny Mitchell's name quite a bit, but we also had Rob Owens and Jenna Klein who were running the back end logistics. For those of you who are interested in our work, we will be continuing this work-based learning series in the fall. So we're taking a little bit of a summer hiatus, but in the fall, we will actually have one of our state or local workforce investment boards. So many of you had questions about how do we build those partnerships. We can help. So we hope that you stay engaged with our work, sign up for our newsletter, and absolutely send Evan all of your questions because I have them. Thank you so much for spending the morning with us, and have the wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Bye.